In the year 1850, the cotton fields of Wilcox County, Alabama, stretched out endlessly beneath a harsh sun that seemed to scorch not only the land, but the very spirits of the laborers toiling below. The Blackwood plantation stood as a testament to prosperity achieved through suffering, its white-columned manor looming like a ghost above the slave quarters where families lived in conditions that defied human dignity. It was in this place, amidst the quiet prayers and suppressed weeping that echoed through the slave cabins each night, that a certain question would be posed, a question both simple and profoundly destructive, one that would expose secrets buried deeper than any grave. The boy who would voice this question was named Samuel. Born into servitude in 1842, his entire world was defined by the plantation's boundaries, his existence shaped by the crack of an overseer's whip and the ceaseless rhythm of cotton picking. His mother, called Celia by the masters, although her true name had been stolen along with her liberty, worked within the plantation house as a cook and seamstress. She was known for her silence, moving through the mansion like a shadow, her gaze always lowered, her voice barely a whisper. What distinguished Samuel, marking him from birth in ways that both protected and imperiled him, was his physical appearance. While his mother's skin possessed the deep richness that affirmed her African heritage, Samuel's skin tone was lighter, his features more defined, and his hair softer in texture. In the cruel calculations of slavery, where lineage dictated fate, Samuel occupied a perilous middle ground, too dark to be free, yet too fair to be ignored. The other children in the quarters would speak of Samuel in hushed tones when they believed he couldn't hear. They mentioned how Master Josiah Blackwood would occasionally pause during his inspections of the slave quarters, gazing at the boy with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, but something far more intricate and troubling. The adults would quickly silence such talk, their faces hardening with fear. But children perceive what grown-ups choose to overlook, and Samuel gradually sensed that his existence was somehow different, somehow flawed, in ways he could not yet grasp. For 8 years, Celia had meticulously constructed careful falsehoods and partial truths to shield her son from a reality that would have shattered his young mind. When Samuel inquired why his skin was different from hers, she explained that God painted all his children in various colors, like flowers in a garden. When he wondered why the master never looked directly at him, yet never punished him either, she claimed that some individuals were simply born with an unseen protection. These explanations satisfied a child's curiosity. However, as Samuel matured and grew more perceptive, the questions became increasingly difficult to avoid. The plantation house where Celia labored was a world unto itself, filled with elegant furniture imported from Europe and portraits of Blackwood ancestors whose pale eyes seemed to follow visitors through every room. Master Josiah was a man of 43, unmarried despite the social expectations tied to his class and wealth. His sister, Margaret Blackwood, functioned as the plantation's mistress, governing the household with an iron grip veiled in velvet gloves. She was known for her charitable activities among the local church community and her strict devotion to moral principles. Yet there were whispers among the enslaved people concerning the true nature of the Blackwood family's piety. The overseer, a brutal man named Hayes, who had worked plantations from Virginia to Louisiana, controlled the fields with a legendary ruthlessness, even in an era where such cruelty was common. He carried a whip he called his teacher, asserting it could instruct any slave in proper conduct within 3 lashes. The slaves referred to him as the devil's right hand, and mothers quieted crying children by threatening that Hayes would hear them. But even Hayes, with all his power and cruel authority, appeared to recognize that certain slaves were off limits, and Samuel was one of them. Life on the plantation followed routines as ancient as the institution of slavery itself. Before dawn, the horn would sound, summoning the field hands to yet another day of exhausting labor. Children like Samuel were not yet old enough for the fields, but they had their own tasks, feeding poultry, gathering eggs, and helping with the never-ending washing that kept the plantation operating. It was during these daily chores that Samuel started observing patterns that troubled him, occurrences that seemed too frequent to be mere coincidence. There was the way Master Blackwood would contrive reasons to visit the kitchen when Celia was working, dwelling on conversations about household affairs that could have been resolved in moments. There was the unusual protection that surrounded Samuel and his mother, an invisible barrier that shielded them from the worst punishments, even when other slaves suffered for minor offenses. And there was something in his mother's eyes whenever the master was nearby, not fear, which would have been understandable, but a kind of hopeless sorrow that hinted at a wound that would never heal. The other slave children had their own observations, shared in whispered talks when adults were out of earshot. They spoke of seeing Master Blackwood standing in the shadows of the quarters late at night, not checking or intimidating, but simply watching. They described how he would sometimes reach out toward Samuel as if to touch his hair or face, then quickly retract his hand. These were dangerous observations, the kind that could get a slave killed if overheard by the wrong people. But children are natural investigators, and the riddle of Samuel's position in the plantation hierarchy both fascinated and terrified them. Celia's protective instincts had been sharpened by years of navigating the perilous existence of plantation life. She knew that her son's likeness to Master Blackwood was growing more pronounced with each passing year, and she understood the implications of that resemblance in ways Samuel could not yet grasp. The boy was a walking reminder of hidden shame, a living testament to the hypocrisy that plagued even the supposedly most devout households in the antebellum South. In the slave quarters, where privacy was a non-existent luxury, and every conversation might be overheard by hostile listeners, Celia had mastered the skill of silence. She moved through her days like a woman walking on thin ice, always aware that one mistake could send her and her son plunging into an abyss from which there would be no escape. She prepared the master's meals, repaired his clothes, and managed his household with the competence and discretion that had kept her alive for nearly 3 decades of bondage. But children, no matter how sheltered, eventually ask the questions adults fear most to answer. In the spring of 1850, as Samuel neared his 8th birthday, and his likeness to Master Blackwood became impossible to deny for anyone with eyes to see, the moment Celia had dreaded finally arrived. It was a Tuesday morning in May, the kind of day when the Alabama heat was just beginning to intensify toward the oppressive summer. Samuel had been sent to gather herbs from the kitchen garden, a task that permitted him to move through parts of the plantation usually off-limits to slave children. As he worked among the neat rows of sage and thyme, he heard voices coming from the master's study, raised in what sounded like a disagreement between Master Blackwood and his sister Margaret. The window was open to capture the morning breeze, and Samuel, with the natural curiosity of a child, found himself drawn to listen. What he heard would alter his comprehension of his world forever, though the full meaning would take years to unfold. "The boy grows more like you every single day." Margaret's voice was sharp with accusation. "People are starting to notice. The pastor mentioned it just last Sunday, inquiring after your young relative. How much longer do you think this pretense can go on?" Master Blackwood's reply was indistinct, but Samuel caught fragments. "My responsibility cannot simply," and then more clearly, "he is my son, Margaret. Whatever his circumstances, whatever his mother's position, he carries my blood." The words struck Samuel like a physical blow. He dropped the basket of herbs, scattering them across the garden path, and ran. He raced through the meticulously maintained grounds of the plantation house, past the stables where horses worth more than human lives were groomed and fed. past the smokehouse where meat was preserved for the master's table while slave children went hungry. He ran until his lungs ached and his legs gave out, finally collapsing in the shade of an ancient oak tree that had stood guard over the plantation since before the first slaves arrived. When Celia found him there hours later, his face was smeared with tears and dirt, his small body trembling with uncontrollable sobs. She knelt beside him in the red Alabama clay, her own heart breaking as she realized that the careful shield of protection she had built around her son's innocence had finally shattered. "Mama," Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse from crying, "why does the master look like me?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from an unquenchable fire. Celia looked into her son's eyes, eyes that were hazel like his father's, not brown like her own, and knew that the time for protective lies was over. The truth was about to emerge, bringing with it consequences that neither she nor Samuel could yet envision. In the distance, the plantation bell rang, calling slaves back to their duties. But for this moment, mother and son remained frozen in time, balanced on the precipice of a revelation that would expose the deepest hypocrisies of their world. The boy, who had lived his entire life as property, was about to discover that he was also the master's son, a truth that would make him neither completely free nor fully slave, but something far more dangerous, living evidence of the moral corruption that infected even the most devout households in the American South. The oak tree under which they sat had witnessed generations of such moments, providing cover for countless conversations between mothers and children forced to navigate the impossible labyrinth of slavery's contradictions. Its branches had listened to quiet prayers for freedom, desperate plans for escape, and private moments of affection stolen from a system designed to dismantle the bonds between families. Now, it would bear witness to a different kind of breaking, as an 8-year-old boy began to comprehend the genuine nature of the world into which he had been born. As the sun climbed higher in the Alabama sky, casting harsh shadows across the plantation grounds, Celia made a choice that would change both their lives permanently. She would tell Samuel the truth, not all of it, for he was still too young for the full horror of her narrative, but enough to help him understand his place in a world that saw him as both victim and potential danger. It was a discussion that would resonate through the years to come, shaping the boy's understanding of justice, authority, and the terrible price of secrets kept too long. The plantation around them carried on its daily routine, oblivious that in the shade of an ancient oak tree, a mother was about to explain to her son why he bore the face of his oppressor, and why that resemblance would make his life more perilous with each passing year. The truth that had been concealed for 8 years was finally demanding to be heard, and with it would come consequences that no one, not Celia, not Samuel, and certainly not Master Josiah Blackwood, could fully foresee or manage. In the months following Samuel's devastating realization, the fragile equilibrium that had maintained an uneasy calm on the Blackwood plantation began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. The boy's new knowledge changed him, aging his features in a way that had nothing to do with the passage of time and everything to do with the burden of comprehending truths no child should have to bear. His resemblance to Master Blackwood, always present but somehow ignored in the willful denial that slavery required, now seemed impossible to overlook. Celia had done her utmost to clarify the inexplicable, choosing her words with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. She informed Samuel that sometimes powerful men took what they wanted from powerless women, that children born from such pairings lived in a world between worlds, belonging fully to neither. She spoke of love where it existed and survival where love was impossible, constructing a narrative that preserved some remnants of her son's innocence while preparing him for the realities he would encounter. But children often understand more than adults realize, and Samuel grasped the implications of his mother's careful explanations with a clarity that terrified her. He began to view the plantation differently, observing the way other light-skinned slaves moved through their days with a particular weariness, realizing for the first time that he was not unique in carrying the lineage of his oppressors. The revelation illuminated patterns that had always been present but previously existed beyond his understanding. Master Blackwood himself seemed to sense that the atmosphere of his domain had changed. During his daily inspections of the plantation, his eyes would linger on Samuel with an expression that mixed guilt, possession, and something that might have been called affection in different circumstances. The master began leaving small gifts where the boy might find them: a carved wooden horse, a book of Bible stories, and delicacies from the kitchen meant only for the master's table. These offerings were never given directly, always discovered as if by chance, maintaining the pretense that no relationship existed between them. Margaret Blackwood, ever vigilant of her brother's behavior and deeply conscious of the potential scandal Samuel represented, began urging Josiah to make decisions that had been deferred too long. She spoke of selling Celia and Samuel to distant plantations, of the necessity of removing temptation and evidence from their lives. Her words carried the cold practicality of a woman who understood that reputation in their social circle was more valuable than human life, and that Samuel's continued presence endangered both. The other slaves watched these developments with the intense scrutiny of people whose survival relied on reading the emotional currents of their masters. They recognized the signs of impending change, the subtle tensions that preceded major disturbances in plantation life. In the quarters, conversations grew quieter, and parents held their children tighter, understanding that whatever storm was gathering around Samuel and Celia might sweep others along in its path. Samuel himself began to withdraw from the casual friendships he had enjoyed with other slave children. The knowledge of his parentage created a barrier he couldn't cross, making him feel simultaneously superior and inferior, protected and imperiled. He found himself studying Master Blackwood's face during the man's visits to the kitchen, searching for similarities and differences, trying to comprehend what it meant to carry the blood of both oppressor and oppressed in his veins. The boy's change in behavior became a source of increasing anxiety for Celia. She watched her son grapple with questions that had no easy answers, observed him struggling with concepts of identity and belonging that challenged the very foundations of their world. Samuel would sometimes ask why God would permit such confusion to exist, why he had been born into circumstances that made him neither entirely one thing nor another. These were theological questions that tested even Celia's deep faith, forcing her to confront doubts about divine justice that she had spent years suppressing. As summer progressed and the cotton plants grew tall in the Alabama heat, tensions across the plantation continued to mount. Rumors began to circulate among neighboring plantations about the situation at Blackwood, whispers suggesting that the master's moral failings were becoming public knowledge. These stories threatened not only Josiah's reputation, but his standing in a community where maintaining the fiction of racial purity was vital to preserving the entire social order. The overseer Hayes, whose brutal efficiency had always been valued by Master Blackwood, began making suggestions about resolving the problem that Samuel represented. His recommendations carried the subtle threat of a man who understood that problems could be made to vanish in ways that left no trace. Hayes had worked on plantations where inconvenient slaves had simply disappeared, their absence explained by claims of escape attempts or fatal accidents. His willingness to employ such methods was part of what made him valuable to plantation owners who occasionally needed their consciences cleared along with their account books. During this period, Samuel began having nightmares that reflected his growing awareness of his precarious position. He would wake in the small hours of the morning, crying out from dreams where he was chased by faceless figures through endless cotton fields, or where he stood before mirrors that showed him faces he did not recognize. Celia would comfort him as best she could, but she knew that her son was battling psychological wounds that her love alone could not mend. The kitchen where Celia worked became a setting for increasingly tense interactions between her and Master Blackwood. He would find reasons to linger during his visits, sometimes attempting conversations that alluded to their situation without ever stating it directly. These interactions were agonizing for Celia, who understood that any word or gesture could be misinterpreted with deadly consequences. She maintained her appearance of respectful subservience while protecting herself and Samuel from implications that could destroy them both. Margaret Blackwood's pressure on her brother intensified as she received reports from friends and acquaintances about the rumors circulating in their social circles. She spoke of family honor and Christian obligation, arguing that allowing such a situation to continue was not merely socially unacceptable, but morally corrupt. Her arguments held weight because they reflected genuine worries about the viability of their way of life in a society increasingly scrutinized by external forces. Samuel, meanwhile, began seeking knowledge in ways that deeply worried his mother. He would listen at doors and windows, gathering snippets of conversations that painted increasingly clear pictures of his situation. He learned about other plantation children who resembled their masters, about the various fates that awaited such living evidence of slavery's moral contradictions. Some were sold away to remote locations where their parentage would not be recognized. Others simply vanished under circumstances that were never fully explained. A rare few were educated and freed, though such outcomes were exceptional rather than common. The boy's growing awareness of these possibilities filled him with a blend of hope and dread. He began to understand that his future would be determined not by his own wishes or actions, but by calculations involving reputation, convenience, and the complex emotional needs of people who saw him as both son and property. The contradiction inherent in his existence, being simultaneously valued and disposable, created a psychological strain that no child should endure. As autumn approached and the cotton harvest drew near, decisions that had been deferred throughout the summer could no longer be put off. The plantation's annual cycle required attention to practical matters, and Samuel's situation had become too visible to ignore indefinitely, whether through sale, education, or other means. His presence in the delicate structure of Blackwood Plantation would have to be addressed before the social tensions it generated reached a breaking point that could destroy everything Master Blackwood had built. The stage was being set for encounters that would compel all parties to confront truths they had spent years avoiding, revelations that would expose the fundamental contradictions of a society built on the falsehood that human beings could be owned while simultaneously asserting that all humans were created in God's image. The questions that Samuel had begun asking would demand answers that would challenge not just individual consciences, but the entire moral framework of antebellum Southern society. The cotton harvest of 1850 brought with it the kind of intense activity that typically absorbed all attention on the plantation. From before dawn until well after dusk, every capable slave worked to bring in the crop that would determine the year's profits and, by extension, the conditions under which they would survive the coming winter. It was during this period of grueling labor and distraction that Master Blackwood made a choice that would change the course of Samuel's life in ways that no one could have predicted. Rather than selling Samuel and Celia to distant plantations as his sister had demanded, Josiah chose a different path, one that reflected both his genuine affection for his son and his desire to retain some level of control over a situation that had become increasingly uncomfortable. He approached Dr. Elias Weatherby, the plantation's physician and one of the few men in Wilcox County whose discretion could be trusted absolutely, with a proposition that would test the limits of what was socially acceptable even in their tolerant society. Dr. Weatherby was a man in his 60s, educated at Harvard Medical School before returning to Alabama to serve the health needs of the planter class. He had delivered hundreds of babies, both white and black, and had long ago ceased to be surprised by the complexities of plantation family structures. His medical practice had made him privy to secrets that could have ruined dozens of prominent families, and his continued success depended on his ability to provide solutions to problems that could not be discussed in polite company. The arrangement Josiah proposed was simple in its elegance and revolutionary in its implications. Samuel would be removed from the plantation environment, but not sold away to unknown masters. Instead, he would be sent to Dr. Weatherby's household in the county seat of Camden, where he would serve as a house servant while secretly receiving the education typically reserved for white children. The pretense would be maintained that Samuel was simply another slave being trained for more sophisticated household duties, but in reality, he would be learning to read, write, and calculate in preparation for a future that remained uncertain but held possibilities that no slave child could normally imagine. Celia received the news of this decision with emotions so complex that she struggled to comprehend them. Relief that her son would be removed from the immediate danger of his situation mingled with terror at the prospect of separation. Joy at the possibility of Samuel receiving an education competed with fear that this unusual arrangement would ultimately place him in even greater jeopardy. She understood that Josiah's plan represented both an unprecedented opportunity and a gamble that could cost Samuel his life if it were discovered by the wrong people. The final weeks before Samuel's departure were marked by a kind of controlled hysteria that affected everyone aware of the situation. Celia spent her days teaching Samuel every lesson she could think of about surviving in a world that would view his education as both valuable and dangerous. She spoke about the importance of never revealing the full extent of his learning, of understanding when knowledge should be displayed and when it should be concealed. These were survival skills that no mother should have to teach her child. But Celia had learned long ago that normal parenting was a luxury unavailable to slaves. Samuel himself experienced this transition period as a series of conflicting emotions that left him exhausted and confused. The idea of leaving his mother filled him with dread, but the possibility of learning to read and write sparked an excitement he struggled to contain. He had observed how literacy transformed the few slaves who possessed it, giving them power and opportunities that remained invisible to those who could not access the written word. At the same time, he understood that his education would make him different from other slaves in ways that could prove perilous. Master Blackwood's behavior during this period reflected his own internal struggles with the decision he had made. He found himself seeking opportunities to speak with Samuel, offering advice and encouragement while maintaining the pretense that their relationship was nothing more than that of a kind master preparing a favored slave for advancement. These conversations were awkward and painful for both participants, representing the closest they had ever come to acknowledging the truth of their connection while still upholding the fiction that kept them both safe. Margaret Blackwood watched these preparations with deep reservations, understanding that her brother's plan represented a dangerous departure from established social norms. She worried that education would make Samuel unhappy with his status, that knowledge would create expectations that could never be fulfilled within the confines of their society. Her concerns were not entirely selfish. She had observed other educated slaves struggle with the psychological strain of understanding their situation too clearly, some driven to despair by their inability to reconcile their abilities with their circumstances. The other slaves on the plantation observed Samuel's impending departure with the blend of curiosity and caution that marked their response to any unusual development. Some viewed his selection for household service as evidence of favoritism that they could not openly admit but privately resented. Others understood the true nature of his situation and worried about the precedent his education might set, fearing that it could disrupt the careful balance that allowed their community to function within the brutal constraints of slavery. Dr. Weatherby, meanwhile, was making his own preparations for Samuel's arrival. His household already included 2 educated slaves, a man named Augustus, who served as his medical assistant, and a woman called Prudence, who managed his correspondence and accounts. Both had been trained by Weatherby himself and represented examples of how education could benefit slaves while also serving their master's interests. The doctor believed that Samuel's quick intelligence and unusual background would allow him to thrive in this environment, although he also understood the unique challenges the boy would face. The doctor's own reasons for accepting Josiah's proposal were complex. Professional curiosity played a part. He was genuinely interested in observing how a child of mixed heritage would respond to formal education. Financial incentives were also a factor, as Josiah had offered significant payment for Samuel's care and training. But perhaps most importantly, Weatherby was fascinated by the experimental nature of the arrangement, viewing it as an opportunity to test theories about human potential that were beginning to emerge in educated circles throughout the country. As the day of Samuel's departure drew near, Celia found herself caught between the desperate wish to keep her son close and the recognition that this opportunity might represent his only chance for a life beyond the crushing limitations of field slavery. She spent hours teaching him prayers and songs that would help him remember her love during the years of separation they both knew lay ahead. These intimate moments were priceless, representing the last time they would be able to share affection openly without fear of observation or misinterpretation. The logistics of Samuel's transfer were managed carefully to minimize attention and speculation. He would travel to Camden in Dr. Weatherby's carriage, supposedly accompanying the doctor on one of his routine visits to patients in the county seat. Once there, he would simply vanish into the doctor's household, becoming part of a domestic staff large enough to absorb one additional member without attracting notice. The false story would be maintained that he had been purchased by Weatherby for his medical knowledge and training capabilities. On the morning of his departure, Samuel stood in the kitchen where his mother had worked for so many years, surrounded by familiar sights and smells that he was seeing for the last time as a child. The weight of the moment pressed down on him with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. He understood that he was crossing a line from which there could be no return, leaving behind not only his mother and the only home he had ever known, but his entire identity as he had understood it. Celia's goodbye was necessarily brief and appeared casual, conducted under the watchful eyes of household staff who could not be trusted with the truth of their relationship. She pressed a small cloth bundle into Samuel's hands, containing items that would help him remember her during the long separation ahead. Her final words were spoken in a whisper that carried all the love, hope, and fear she felt. Remember who you are, child. Remember that you are loved, no matter what else happens. As Dr. Weatherby's carriage rolled away from the plantation, carrying Samuel toward a future that remained unwritten and uncertain, those left behind struggled to adjust to an absence that created ripples throughout the entire community. Celia would return to her duties with the mechanical efficiency of someone functioning despite profound loss. Master Blackwood would immerse himself in plantation business with unusual intensity, attempting to escape the guilt and uncertainty that Samuel's departure had amplified rather than resolved. And Margaret Blackwood would persist in her efforts to restore normal order to a household that had been forever changed by the presence of a child who was neither fully slave nor fully son, but somehow both. The road to Camden stretched ahead of Samuel like a symbol for the uncertain path his life would now follow. Behind him lay the only world he had ever known, with all its contradictions and cruelties. Ahead waited possibilities he could barely imagine, opportunities that came burdened with dangers he was only beginning to understand. The boy who had asked why the master looked like him was about to discover that some questions once asked change everything forever. Dr. Weatherby's household in Camden represented a vastly different world from the agricultural rhythms of plantation life. The doctor's residence, a substantial brick house on the town's main street, served multiple roles as a family home, medical office, and informal school for the slaves whose education served both humanitarian and practical purposes. Samuel's introduction to this environment marked the beginning of a transformation that would challenge every assumption he had developed about his place in Southern society. Augustus, the medical assistant who had worked with Dr. Weatherby for over 15 years, became Samuel's first instructor in the complex maneuvering required for educated slaves. A man in his 40s with scarred hands that evidenced years of assisting with surgical procedures, Augustus possessed an intellect that had been carefully cultivated while remaining concealed from all but a select few. His lessons for Samuel extended far beyond reading and writing to encompass the psychological skills necessary for survival in their unique position. "Knowledge is power," Augustus explained during one of their early conversations. "But displayed knowledge is danger. You must learn to be smart enough to be useful, but never so smart as to be threatening. The white folks who educate us need to believe they remain our superiors, even as they depend on our capabilities to maintain their own positions." Prudence, who managed Dr. Weatherby's correspondence and financial records, reinforced these lessons through her own example. A woman of perhaps 35, with hands perpetually stained with ink and a mind capable of calculations that surpassed many educated white men, she demonstrated daily how intelligence could be wielded as a tool for advancement within the limitations of their society. Her interactions with the doctor's white patients and business associates were masterful displays of deference that concealed razor-sharp analytical abilities. Samuel's formal education began with basic literacy skills, but quickly expanded to include subjects few white children of his age were studying. Dr. Weatherby believed in thorough intellectual development and introduced his young protege to mathematics, natural philosophy, basic medical knowledge, and even rudimentary Latin. The boy's rapid grasp of these subjects surprised even the doctor, who had expected intelligence but was unprepared for the depth of Samuel's curiosity and retention. The psychological adjustment to this new life proved more challenging than the intellectual demands. Samuel found himself caught between worlds in ways that created constant internal strain. In the doctor's household, he was encouraged to think, question, and learn with an intensity that fed his eager mind. But beyond those walls, Camden society operated according to the same racial hierarchies that governed plantation life, and Samuel was forced to constantly remember which identity he could display in which circumstances. Letters from his mother arrived irregularly, carried by trusted intermediaries who traveled between the plantation and town on various errands. These communications were necessarily brief and cryptic, expressing love and concern while avoiding any details that could prove dangerous if intercepted. Celia's messages spoke of seasonal changes, household news, and her prayers for Samuel's well-being, but between the lines the boy could discern his mother's longing and worry. Master Blackwood's influence over Samuel's new situation remained significant but carefully hidden. The financial arrangements that supported the boy's education and care were channeled through Dr. Weatherby in ways that maintained plausible deniability about their true source. Occasionally, the master would visit Camden on business and would find excuses to observe Samuel from a distance, checking on his progress while maintaining the pretense that no special relationship existed between them. As months passed and Samuel's education advanced, his understanding of his unique position deepened in ways that both empowered and troubled him. He began to grasp the wider implications of slavery as an economic and social system, understanding how his own mixed heritage represented both the contradictions inherent in that system and the potential for its eventual transformation. These realizations were intellectually captivating but emotionally devastating for a boy still struggling to understand his own identity. The other residents of Camden gradually became aware of the unusually intelligent young slave in Dr. Weatherby's household, though none suspected the true extent of Samuel's education. He was observed reading medical texts that challenged even educated adults, assisting with procedures that required both manual skill and theoretical understanding, and demonstrating capabilities that seemed to exceed his presumed status. These observations generated conversations among the town's elite that reflected growing anxiety about the implications of educating slaves. Samuel's relationship with Dr. Weatherby evolved into something resembling mentorship, though both participants understood the limitations that their respective positions imposed. The doctor found genuine satisfaction in nurturing such a promising intellect, while Samuel discovered in his teacher a model of how knowledge could be pursued for its own sake, rather than simply as a tool for survival. Their daily discussions covered topics that challenged conventional thinking about race, intelligence, and human potential. However, this intellectual growth occurred against a backdrop of increasing political tension that would soon affect everyone in their community. The Compromise of 1850 had momentarily diffused national conflicts over slavery, but in Alabama, debates about the institution's future were escalating among educated classes who understood that external pressures were mounting. Dr. Weatherby's household, with its unconventional approach to slave education, represented exactly the kind of experiment that critics of slavery pointed to as evidence of the system's internal contradictions. During this period, Samuel began experiencing what could only be described as an identity crisis that reflected his impossible position between two worlds. His education had given him the intellectual means to analyze his situation with a clarity that was psychologically devastating. He understood that his white heritage provided certain protections and opportunities, while his enslaved status negated any legal rights or social standing. This knowledge created a psychological burden that manifested in periods of depression and anger that worried his caretakers. The boy's emotional struggles were complicated by his physical development, which was making his resemblance to Master Blackwood increasingly pronounced. Visitors to Dr. Weatherby's household sometimes remarked on Samuel's unusual features, speculating about his heritage in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. These observations reminded all concerned that the pretense supporting Samuel's presence in Camden was becoming harder to maintain as he matured. Margaret Blackwood's concerns about her brother's experiment proved prescient, as reports of Samuel's capabilities reached social circles that included some of Alabama's most prominent families. Conversations at dinner parties and church gatherings began to include references to the remarkable young slave at Dr. Weatherby's house, discussions that carried undertones of both admiration and unease. Some viewed the boy's education as evidence of Negro capability, while others saw it as proof that educating slaves created dangerous expectations and dissatisfaction. As 1851 dawned, Samuel faced his 9th birthday with a mix of pride in his achievements and uncertainty about his future. His education had proceeded beyond what anyone had initially thought possible, but success brought its own complications. The more capable he became, the more questions his situation raised about the fundamental assumptions underlying their society. His very existence challenged beliefs about racial hierarchy that formed the foundation of the Southern social order. The question that had begun this journey, why the master looked like him, had evolved into dozens of other questions that seemed to multiply faster than they could be answered. Samuel now understood the biological and social reasons for his resemblance to Master Blackwood. But that understanding had opened up philosophical and moral inquiries that challenged the basic premises of the world in which he lived. His education had given him the tools to analyze his situation. But analysis only highlighted the contradictions and injustices that defined his existence. Dr. Weatherby himself was beginning to question the wisdom of the experiment he had undertaken. While Samuel's intellectual progress exceeded all expectations, the psychological costs of the boy's position were becoming increasingly clear. The doctor worried that they were creating expectations that their society could never fulfill, preparing Samuel for a life that might not be possible within the constraints of Southern law and custom. As spring arrived in Camden, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of agricultural renewal, Samuel continued his studies while grappling with questions that had no easy answers. His situation remained unique in their community, representing both an extraordinary opportunity and a dangerous precedent that challenged fundamental assumptions about race, intelligence, and social order. The boy, who had begun by asking about physical resemblance, was now confronting mysteries of identity and belonging that would shape the rest of his life in ways none of them could yet imagine. The question that would ultimately expose everything was building toward its moment of expression, though no one yet realized how completely it would transform their carefully constructed arrangements. Samuel's education had given him not just knowledge, but the confidence to seek answers to questions that polite society preferred to leave unasked. And in a world built on falsehoods and silences, such questions had the power to bring down structures that had seemed permanent and unshakable. By the summer of 1851, Samuel's education under Dr. Weatherby had progressed to levels that would have been remarkable for any child of his age, regardless of race. His abilities in mathematics, natural philosophy, and medical theory had developed to the point where he could assist the doctor with procedures that required both intellectual sophistication and practical skill. However, this academic success was creating complications that none of them had fully anticipated when the arrangement began. The revelation that Master Blackwood had been planning his freedom created emotions in Samuel that were almost impossible to process. Joy at the prospect of liberation mixed with anger at having been kept ignorant of these plans. Understanding that his father cared enough to risk social standing for his welfare competed with resentment that this care had been expressed through secrecy and deception rather than open acknowledgement. Within weeks of Samuel's discovery, the careful balance maintaining their situation began to collapse. Margaret Blackwood, learning of her brother's manumission plans through household servants who had overheard conversations, threatened to expose the entire arrangement unless it was terminated immediately. Her ultimatum forced a crisis that had been brewing since Samuel first asked his devastating question years earlier. Master Blackwood arrived in Camden on a September morning, heavy with the weight of decisions that could no longer be postponed. His meeting with Dr. Weatherby and Samuel took place in the doctor's study, where the boy's education had flourished and where his future would now be decided. The conversation was formal, yet emotionally intense, representing the closest the three of them had ever come to acknowledging the true nature of their relationships. "The situation has become impossible to sustain," Blackwood explained, his voice conveying an exhaustion that reflected months of internal struggle. "Margaret threatens exposure that would destroy not only our family's reputation, but your safety as well. The political climate makes it impossible to proceed with manumission as planned." Samuel listened to this discussion of his fate with the composure that his education had taught him. But inside, his emotions raged with the intensity of someone watching their dreams disappear. The freedom that had seemed within reach was being withdrawn due to forces beyond his control, returning him to a state of uncertainty that was perhaps worse than never having hoped at all. Dr. Weatherby proposed an alternative that would allow Samuel to maintain some benefits of his education while removing him from the immediate danger of exposure. The boy would be sent to New Orleans, where the more complex racial hierarchies of that cosmopolitan city might allow him to work as a skilled artisan or even eventually purchase his own freedom. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered Samuel some hope for a future beyond slavery. The final weeks of Samuel's time in Camden were marked by intense preparation for a journey that would take him farther from his mother than he had ever been. Dr. Weatherby provided him with falsified papers documenting skills in carpentry and masonry that would make him valuable in the New Orleans construction trades. More importantly, he gave Samuel letters of introduction to abolitionists who might assist his eventual escape to freedom in the North. Samuel's farewell to Dr. Weatherby was necessarily brief, but deeply emotional. The man who had served as teacher, protector, and surrogate father pressed a small package into the boy's hands, containing money, additional documentation, and a letter explaining his true parentage for use if circumstances ever made such a revelation beneficial rather than dangerous. The journey to New Orleans in October 1851 marked the conclusion of one chapter in Samuel's life and the beginning of another that would test everything his education had taught him about survival and self-determination. He traveled in the company of a slave trader who believed he was simply transporting another piece of property, unaware that his cargo possessed intellectual capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of slavery itself. Years would pass before Samuel saw his mother again, and when they were reunited, both had been changed by experiences that tested the limits of human resilience. Celia had aged prematurely from worry and separation, while Samuel had grown into a young man whose education and experiences had given him perspectives that few of his generation could claim. Master Blackwood never publicly acknowledged his son, but he followed Samuel's eventual success in New Orleans through reports that confirmed the wisdom of the education he had arranged. The boy who had asked why the master looked like him grew into a man who used his unusual background and exceptional education to help other slaves find paths to freedom through the Underground Railroad. The question that had initiated this journey was ultimately answered not through words, but through actions that proved the fundamental equality of human potential, regardless of the circumstances of birth. Samuel's story became part of the broader narrative of slavery's internal contradictions, demonstrating how the system's own hypocrisies created the conditions for its eventual destruction. Margaret Blackwood's fears about exposure proved unfounded, but her victory in preventing immediate manumission came at a cost that haunted her for the rest of her life. She had preserved her family's reputation while condemning a gifted child to years of unnecessary bondage, a choice that reflected the moral blindness that made slavery possible, but ultimately unsustainable. Dr. Weatherby continued his medical practice and his quiet work educating selected slaves, though he never again attempted an experiment as ambitious as Samuel's education. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about the courage required to challenge social norms and the personal costs of moral compromise in an immoral system. The records of Samuel's time in Camden were carefully preserved by Dr. Weatherby, who understood their historical significance, even if their immediate impact was limited. These documents would eventually contribute to scholarly understanding of slavery's complexities and the remarkable individuals who transcended its limitations through intelligence, determination, and the courage to ask questions that others feared to voice. In 1862, Samuel's story came full circle when he returned to Alabama as a free man wearing the uniform of the Union Army. He served as a scout and interpreter, using his knowledge of the region and his understanding of slavery's operations to assist in the liberation of other enslaved people. His military service represented both personal vindication and symbolic victory over the system that had once claimed to own him. The plantation where Samuel had been born was among those he helped liberate during the Civil War's final campaigns. Standing in the kitchen where his mother had worked, and where he had first learned to question the contradictions around him, Samuel reflected on the journey that had taken him from enslaved child to educated freeman to Union soldier. Celia lived to see her son's triumph, though she did not survive long enough to witness the full flourishing of the freedom that his questions had helped create. Her faith that education and courage could overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression had been confirmed by events she could never have imagined when she first tried to explain to a confused boy why he resembled his oppressor. Master Blackwood died in 1864, never having publicly acknowledged his son, but having lived long enough to see the world that had shaped their impossible relationship crumble around him. His final words, according to witnesses, were an apology spoken to empty air, suggesting that conscience had finally overcome the social pressures that had prevented him from claiming Samuel openly. The question, "Why does the master look like me, mother?" had exposed everything, just as the most innocent questions sometimes do. It revealed the moral contradictions that made slavery impossible to sustain, the human cost of systems built on racial falsehoods, and the power of education to transform individuals and ultimately society itself. Samuel's story became part of the wider narrative of American freedom, proof that human potential cannot be permanently suppressed by legal bondage or social prejudice. The boy who had been born into slavery but educated in secret grew into a man who helped destroy the system that had claimed to own him, demonstrating that some questions once asked change everything forever. The record suggests that Samuel lived until 1903, dying as a respected educator and community leader in Chicago. His final years were devoted to establishing schools for freed slaves, ensuring that other children would have access to the education that had transformed his own life. He never forgot the question that had started his journey toward freedom, and he never stopped believing in the power of knowledge to overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression. The slave boy's question had indeed exposed everything, not through a sudden dramatic revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of courage, education, and determination that ultimately proved more powerful than the chains that had once bound him.